For today's episode, we're heading back into the world of birds. I want to tell you about some birds that, despite being relatively common and widespread in North America, not many people have probably heard about them or know about them, let alone have seen one. And that's because they're found in very specific places, those places being wetlands. And within that wetland habitat, they're incredibly well camouflaged. So let's take a closer look at a heron you've probably never heard of, the bittern. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. Now, you might have already picked up from the title of the episode and my intro there that bitterns are a species of heron. There's 14 species of bittern worldwide, but only two of those live here in North America, the American bittern and the least bittern. Now, don't be fooled into thinking that any animal with least in its common name is less interesting than other members of that species. When it comes to common names for various animals, least and greater are simply a reference to the general size of that particular animal relative to others of the same species and kind. So the least bittern is just smaller than the American bittern, but still really cool in its own right. But let's start with the larger of the two, the American bittern. American bitterns are medium sized herons, standing 2 to just over 2.5 feet tall, 58 to 85 centimeters, with thick, compact bodies. They have shorter legs and thicker necks than typical herons and a slightly hunched posture. Their dagger like bill is long, straight, and sharply pointed. The wings are broad. Their wingspan averages about 3.5 feet, 92 centimeters, but the wingtips are somewhat pointed. The Cornell Lab's All About Birds website describes their color as streaky brown, buff, and white. And to be honest, that's about all you need to know about the color of their plumage. But in the interest of full disclosure, if you go to the Wikipedia page for American bitterns, it gives a detailed description of their plumage: the crown, the hind neck, the sides of the neck, the scapulars, the mantle, and on and on. But the end result is streaky brown, buff, and white. In flight, the outer wings contrast sharply with the brown of the rest of the bird, and like other herons, it hunches its neck in flight rather than stretching it out. American bitterns are widespread. Their range includes most of North America, breeding as far north as British Columbia and Hudson's Bay in Canada, most of the United States, and south into central Mexico. Now, within that range, they're found mainly in freshwater marshes with tall vegetation. They're not too particular about the size of the wetland, but they usually prefer those that are less densely vegetated and shallower than the wetlands that are used by their smaller cousin, the least bittern. Remember that because I'm going to come back to it. Because they're primarily wading birds, in the northern part of their range, American bitterns migrate in the fall, primarily to coastal areas where the water doesn't freeze. Here in the United States, they overwinter in the Gulf Coast region, most notably Florida's Everglades, but also islands in the Caribbean and down into Mexico. They might even travel as far south as Panama and Costa Rica. Overwintering bitterns may occasionally forage in dry grasslands or other terrestrial habitats, or use brackish marshes. In fact, managed wetlands like wildlife refuges are important habitat for wintering American bitterns. But despite being widespread and fairly common, they can be tough to find. I can't say that I've ever seen one, owing mainly to the fact that this streaky brown, buff, and white bird camouflages incredibly well with its habitat. In fact, possibly the most famous aspect of bittern behavior is the stance it adopts when it senses danger. It points its bill straight to the sky, elongates its body, and even sways with the breeze, all to blend in with its reedy surroundings. This pose is so ingrained in bitterns that they sometimes adopt it even when they're out in the open. Now, thanks to this camouflage, American bitterns are more often heard than they are seen. A male's call has been said to sound like a congested pump, and while uttering this sound, the bird's head is thrown convulsively upward and forward, and the sound is repeated up to 7 times. This booming, clacking, gulping call has earned them some colorful nicknames, including Stake Driver, Thunder Pumper, Water Belcher, and Mire Drum. When field scientists want to trap American bitterns for study, they take advantage of the male's aggressive territoriality. Knowing that the birds will respond to other males' calls from as far as 1,600 feet or 500 meters away, or to the image of another male, the researchers will use recorded calls and mirrors to draw the birds in. Now, what's really interesting, though, is how they make this call, which is not fully understood. It's thought that the bird gradually puffs out its neck by inflating its esophagus with air, which is accompanied by a mild clicking or hiccuping sound. The esophagus is kept inflated thanks to flaps beside the tongue. Once the esophagus is fully inflated, the distinctive gulping sound is made in the syrinx, the vocal organ of birds. Then, when finished, the bird deflates the esophagus. Like other herons, American bitterns are predators, feeding on insects, especially dragonflies, which they can sometimes snatch in midair, crustaceans, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and even small mammals like meadow voles. American bitterns are solitary foragers, primarily hunting at dusk and dawn in dim light near the shore and the fringes of vegetated areas. They stand motionless or walk slowly with outspread toes in search of food. A foraging bird may sway its neck to help it see past the glare from the surface of the water, or to warm up its neck muscles for a quick strike. The American bittern's yellow eyes can actually focus downward, which gives the bird's face kind of a startled, cross eyed appearance. It's thought that this enhances the bird's ability to spot and capture prey. On a side note, their eyes turn orange during the breeding season. A characteristic hunting strategy is to stand stock still with the bill held horizontal, gradually aiming the bill downward with nearly imperceptible movements, until with a sudden darting motion the bittern seizes its prey in its bill, bites or shakes it to death, and swallows it head first. Indigestible parts of the prey are regurgitated as pellets, just like an owl. American bitterns are solitary, and other than migrating in small groups, they only come together during mating or when facing off over territory. And territorial battles can be extremely dramatic. Competing males hunker down and approach each other while displaying white plumes between their shoulders. This can escalate into an airborne conflict, with the combatants spiraling upwards, trying to stab each other with their bills. A male that's ready to mate lowers and pumps his head and fluffs out white feathers that are usually hidden beneath his wings. Copulation lasts all of about 15 seconds. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Males and females have little to do with each other apart from that copulation, although a female may nest near a booming male as a way of distracting predators from her brood, so at least he's good for two things. But otherwise, the female American bittern gathers materials, builds the nest, incubates the eggs, broods and feeds the chicks, with no help from the male. Unlike many of their tree nesting heron cousins, the great blue heron, for example, American bitterns usually build their nests among thick stands of cattails, bulrushes, and sedges that grow in shallow water. Less commonly, they nest on dry ground in grassland areas with tall, dense plants. She builds a mound using dead, dry reeds, cattails, and other plant material, 3.5 to 8 inches, 9 to 20 centimeters above the water surface. She lines the nest with fine grasses and lays 2 to 7 eggs. When they hatch 4 weeks later, chicks are atrical, covered in down but helpless. This is kind of a departure from many other ground nesting birds whose chicks are precocial when they hatch, covered in down maybe, but mobile enough to escape many predators. The chicks are fed individually, each in turn pulling down on the female's beak to receive regurgitated food directly into its mouth. Chicks leave the nest at about 2 weeks old and are fully fledged at 6 to 7 weeks. Okay, now let's take a look at the least bittern. Least bitterns are about half the size of American bitterns, 11 to 14 inches long, 28 to 36 centimeters, and have a wingspan of 16 to 18 inches, 41 to 46 centimeters. They are, in fact, the third smallest heron in the world. They're not as streaky as their big cousins. Least bitterns have a dark blackish brown back and lighter brown and creamy underparts. Seen up close, adult males have two white stripes down their back as well. Like many other small herons, least bittern's loral area, which is the spot between the bill and the eye, is unfeathered, and the skin in that spot can change colors depending on what the bird is doing. During courtship, for example, copulation, or territorial conflict, the normal yellowish skin can flush a brilliant cherry red in the males. Least bitterns have long legs and toes, dagger like bills, and long necks that, again, they often keep drawn in, giving it a hunched appearance. When agitated, these birds might raise their crown and neck feathers. But they display the same response to perceived danger as other bitterns, freezing in place with its bill pointing up, both eyes turned toward the source of the alarm, and sometimes even swaying to more closely resemble the wind-blown marsh vegetation. Now, least bitterns are not as widespread as American bitterns. They're found in South and Central America year round, but in the United States, they breed in the eastern half of the country, then winter along the Gulf Coast and Baja California. Now, like the American bittern, least bitterns live mostly in freshwater and brackish marshes with tall stands of cattails and other vegetation. But remember, I said that they like deeper water than the American bittern? Seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? They're significantly smaller, but prefer deeper water. And that's because they forage in a different way. Rather than wade, least bitterns hunt alone, quietly perching at the edge of a stand of reeds, watching for prey. Sometimes they take on acrobatic contortions, gripping multiple reeds and hanging just inches over the surface of the water. Their movements are slow and deliberate when walking or climbing, although they can run rapidly and can compress their bodies to move quickly through dense vegetation. In fact, John James Audubon noted that a young captive least bittern was able to walk with ease through a 1.5 inch gap, 3.8 centimeters, between two books, even though the bird's body normally measured 2.25 inches, 5.7 centimeters, across, indicating that it could compress its body to an extraordinary degree. Now, unlike the American bittern absentee fathers, least bitterns are monogamous, at least during the breeding season, and the male least bittern does his share. The male picks the nest site and constructs a well-hidden nest, with the female sometimes supervising. He builds the nest by pulling out the reeds and crimping them to form a platform and a canopy, which are then held together with stalks and sticks arranged in a spoke-like fashion. When completed, the unlined nest measures about 6 to 8 inches, 15 to 20 centimeters across, and 2 to 5 inches, or 5 to 13 centimeters deep. The foundation is sometimes a nest from previous years, or even an old nest of another species like a marsh wren. The male will even repair the nest as needed while the female is incubating the eggs. Least bitterns are less territorial than American bitterns. Where food is abundant, least bittern pairs might nest close to each other, almost, but not quite, in a colony. In some brackish marshes, most notably in South Carolina, least bitterns will nest close to colonies of boat-tailed grackles, which typically choose areas that don't have ground predators. The grackles also aggressively chase or mob hawks and gulls, which, of course, also protects the bitterns. Before mating, males preen the female's neck and back. A brood is usually 4 or 5 eggs, which are incubated for about 3 weeks. Young remain in the nest for about 2 weeks after hatching. In addition to their nest building and maintenance duties, male least bitterns also help feed the chicks when they hatch. Sometimes least bitterns will actually have a second brood. Now, they're not as vocal as American bitterns, but least bitterns do make cooing and clucking sounds, usually in the early morning or near dusk. Okay, time for some final fun facts. Least bitterns occasionally turn up far, far away from their usual range and habitat. For instance, in September of 2007, a migrant was found at Vilo de Porto Azores in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about 2,600 miles, 4,000 kilometers from its normal range. That's a long way from home. And on that note, my friend, we've come to the end of this episode. If you're enjoying the podcast and you want to help support it, here's how you can do that. Become a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and with 3 paid months, you get free Dispatches from the Forest merch. Find all the details at patreon.com/dispatches from the forest. Donate through either PayPal or Venmo using my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. Also, how you can contact me if you have a question, a comment, or a request for a future episode. You can also donate using the Cash App and the hashtag ForestNerd. You can send a check if that's more your style. Just shoot me a message. I'll provide you with my mailing address. And of course, there's Dispatches from the Forest merch for sale. Go check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/dispatches from the forest. Click on products, see everything that we have to offer. Finally, you can follow Dispatches from the Forest on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. Dispatches from the Forest recognizes that the lands where we live, work, and recreate are the traditional homelands of the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho people. We understand that this land holds immense significance for the original stewards, native nations, and peoples of this region. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.